Hello everybody. For this coloring process, we are finally going to actually do some Batman stuff. I, side note, am extremely excited for this because the last two pages where I showed my penciling process and my inking process, everything up until this point, there has been no Batman in this particular story. This is his introduction, so to speak. So it's a pretty important page, and I'd love to take you through, again, the coloring process of how I sort of think and get everything finished. I am so excited because this is around the 19th page in this this comic book. So 19 pages in a Batman comic book, and I have not been able to draw Batman. And that's not a knock on the writing or the story, because I think his introduction here is absolutely amazing. But as an artist who loves Batman, working on a Batman comic, getting to actually draw the man himself is pretty awesome and really special. But yeah, so I'm going to take you through my coloring process of kind of how all of this works. I actually have already finished the first panel, just so I can get a good idea of what I want to do in the future, and you're not listening to me kind of figure out what to do. I just kind of do it. If that makes sense, so I don't kind of lead you astray or anything. So I'm just going to show my layers here so you can see what style we're looking for this particular image. Batman's grappling hook in this panel shoots through the glass and then clamps onto the underside of the window frame here, and then Batman himself leaps through, breaking the rest of the glass. We get this really cool action shot of him jumping in with the grappling hook still in his hand, and then this final shot, a close-up of him looking menacing, looking a little bit upset. And yeah, I'm so excited to get to working on this. So I'll try not to fanboy the whole time, and I'll try and actually explain my process and how all of this works. But like I mentioned, I finished this panel first so you can kind of get a good idea of the color scheme we're working for, what the glass is going to look like, and then I'm going to go in and show you how all of that is actually finished. But yeah, let's get to this panel right here. For this whole page, we're going to keep it in a very similar way to how the previous few pages have looked as soon as the lights turn off in Porcello's apartment. And in those particular pages, we have this kind of color scheme going on. So we have the ghost character who shows up. This is also a really cool page to work on. And then in this next panel, there's no text here yet, because that's still in the process. The writer Joshua is actually the one who puts the text on the images, does all the animations and stuff. I just sketch and draw and illustrate and color the pages. So this is just, I didn't want to show that because this is the work that I was able to do. I didn't want to show something that I didn't work on. But so this color scheme is what we're going to work on here. So we kind of have a cyan, blue, some teal and green mixed in there, and then purple on the ground for the smog and smog. I keep messing up on that word. Smog and smoke. So the reason why I also wanted to take you through this particular page and not these past two pages is because if you want to watch behind the scenes of how a Batman comic gets made, we might as well skip to Batman himself and color that. So that's why I really didn't go through those past two pages. Plus, it kind of gave me a good idea to work on my own and kind of figure out what I wanted the colors to look like. So now this page is going to be a lot easier to explain instead of me trying to figure everything out in real time. Another thing I wanted to mention, coloring for me, at least, takes the most amount of time whenever I work on my pieces. So to avoid this video being hours long, I may have to speed through and skip through certain parts of the coloring process. So just be aware of that whenever I'm taking you through all of this. I'll try and note everything that's important or everything that I think y'all might get a kick out of. But there might be some sections and parts which I will skip, especially if it has to do with repetition, and I would just be saying the same thing over and over again. But one thing I do want to mention before we get into coloring this particular panel here is you can see that along with the black inks, there's also white inks too, to represent these shards of glass and such. The reason why I decided to do that is because whenever we go into the coloring, a lot of these glass effects are going to actually overlap the inks. Now, in a lot of comics, you don't have a lot of elements, a lot of coloring that overlaps the inks. If these are spot blacks, they stay black. For this particular comic, and again, this isn't something that I came up with or anything, there are plenty of comics that do this, but whenever I take you through this particular process, I am going to showcase how the smog, the smoke, whatever you want to call it, and the glass are two effects which can overlap the black here. Just to kind of give you that mysterious effect. We still play with silhouettes here, obviously. Right here you see the window, there's not much detail in the background because in my mind, if you want to get the point across, make everything look good, if you're adding detail for the sake of adding detail, chances are it's probably not needed. At least that's been my experience. But enough blabbering, let's move on to the actual coloring process. And I apologize if I repeat myself or skip over words or everything. I'm doing this at 9:30 a.m., which is pretty early in the day, so I will be trying to explain in the best of ways and not do what I'm doing right now, which is just go but yeah, let's get into this next page. So you might be able to see, not on the actual screen recording, but in this top image here where you see my hand, hello, I'm gonna move you over here so you can see all my layers and everything. Now, don't judge me. I very rarely label all of my layers. I tend to label groups, but if I'm the only one working on this, I tend not to name stuff. But yeah, so we have the inks here, and now we're just gonna get into coloring. So the first thing I like to do, which I forget if I've mentioned or not, but I'm sure you've noticed, whenever I do my inks, whenever I even sketch too, my back page color is almost never pure white. The reason I do that, I like to keep it at a mid-tone because whenever you're adding color, whenever you're thinking about the highlights and the shadows and such, for me, it's a little bit easier to think about that process when it's not all just white. So this is kind of the mid-tone that I'm searching for right here. This mid-tone could change, it's not exact, it's just kind of something I came up with or I'm thinking about what it's going to turn into. But the first thing I like to do is go in with the shadows. So I'm going to put a layer on multiply. I'm going to grab a color from over here, a darker blue, and sometimes I like to also use the lasso tool to help me out with this. So we're just going to go in here, and I also like to work in layers when it comes to coloring. I don't like to work on one layer just because whenever you work on multiple layers, you can have different elements overlapping each other and edit them freely without having to change or fix a lot of stuff. Another thing I want to mention is that we are going to have the purple smoke kind of rise up from the bottom. So the reason why there's a lot of shadow detail up here in terms of inking but not a lot down here isn't necessarily because it's brighter down here, but because we're eventually going to replace that with this smoke effect from the previous panel. Just some things to think about whenever you're starting this. Okay, so I have a lot of brushes that I like to use, but I'm sure many digital artists can tell you if they have a lot of brushes, they only really use a small amount. So the brush that I'm using to color right now is called, well, I just named it Good Brush, so that doesn't really help y'all. Never mind. I kind of forgot what the actual name of the brush is called, but you can find a lot of free brushes online for Photoshop that'll work really, really well and get the effect that you're going for. The best way I can describe this is it's basically similar to, it's kind of like painting, but kind of like a dry paint. I don't like to work in stuff that's like watercolor or stuff. I like to just put really thick, solid flats down first and not think too much about it. But yeah, as you can see, if you're doing a page and a lot of the panels have a similar color scheme, instead of trying to guess about the colors, if you do the first panel, then you can just color pick from that page, and it makes life a lot easier. But yeah, as you can see, whenever I am doing this, I have one hand actually drawing on the screen. My other hand, which you can't see, is on the keyboard, making the brush size go up and down and up and down as I go. This is something that I've developed as an artist throughout my years of doing digital art. It's kind of hard to explain. I think it just takes a lot of practice and time in order to do stuff like that. And I'm sure there's an easier way to actually do that, but it's the way I'm most proficient in and the way I'm most comfortable in, so I tend not to change it too much. But yeah, so that's the window frame right there. Just colored all this in. Another thing to mention, if you're doing small cracks like this or small indentations, if you add kind of a white, not a white exactly, but a more so highlight around the edge, it makes it look a lot more realistic because edges kind of catch light in that way. Alright, so now that we're mostly done with the main bulk of the back, we're going to move into the actual grappling hook itself. And this grappling hook in particular is basically one for one exactly based on the grappling hook that Robert Pattinson's Batman uses in the Batman film. There's a scene where Batman uses his grappling hook to catapult himself through a window into Riddler's apartment in the movie, and I found that this scene had a lot of really cool homages and similarities with that scene. So in terms of looking for a reference, I am very, very glad that the Batman movie exists so that I don't have to guess on literally everything. So right now, I'm just putting a base color in here. Now, for those of you who don't know what a base color is, it's basically the main midpoint or just main color of an object. And in terms of Photoshop or digital art, this can be used so you can add clipping masks and you can color within this main block of color here, if that makes sense. So whenever I add in the different tones, whenever I go in adding shading, value, highlights, all that good stuff, whenever I do that, I don't have to try and stay within the lines all the time. So I'll do my best to show you exactly how all that works. There are plenty of videos out there on YouTube which can also kind of explain how clipping masks work in Photoshop. So if any of you are interested in working in Photoshop, again, I'll do my best to explain my own process, but I find that there's a lot of really helpful stuff online, especially on YouTube. Me being a digital artist, I've learned a lot from my father, who's a graphic designer, but then I also would take just art classes in school whenever I possibly could. And YouTube, you'd be surprised how much I just learned from YouTube. Just self-taught stuff. But yeah, so as you can see, I'll try and move my actual main camera over and kind of explain what I'm talking about here. So this is the main block of color I just put in here. As you can see, I'm hiding it and showing it. I added a layer on top of that. I hit Control, I press that layer, scroll down here, and it says Create Clipping Mask. So now you can see this particular layer is clipped to the layer behind it. Now what does that mean? It basically means that any layer, any color you put within the clipping mask layer is going to stay within the layer below it. So let's say I pick a white and I'm coloring over here. You don't see anything, right? But then I make my way over here and boom. See, all of it's showing up right here. So that's basically how clipping masks work. I hope I explained that in a reasonably understandable way. But now I can go in, and whenever I add all the color and everything, you can really kind of tell how all of that works. So here I'm just emphasizing the shine, the kind of metal sheen that's on this particular grappling hook. Texture is really important when it comes to any type of artwork, to make it look more real, to feel like you can touch it, even if it's something like a comic book style. But yeah, as you can see, I'm just adding highlights and shadows and such. Getting the bulk of the dark bits down. Another thing I like to do is I'll get a black, but then up here, which I'll move my camera if I can, it says opacity. I'll move the opacity down. Now this isn't the opacity of your actual layer, this is the opacity of your brush. So even though I'm painting with a black, as you can see some of the layers behind it. Which means that if you keep painting like this on top of it, it'll get darker and darker. This, in the best way to describe it, is more so like traditional painting where you paint on layers on top of layers. A lot of the time when painting, it's not just one slab of color and you're done. You have to keep going over and over again, and that's kind of what this brush does. I find it most useful when adding in those really dark spots without making it overly dark and hard to see. But yeah, I think we're in a pretty good place right now. So now I'm going to go in and add some extreme highlights to a lot of these parts of the grappling hook. And I'll check back in with you whenever I'm finished. Alright, so welcome back. So I added a lot of detail in terms of this spine right here. Now, since this is going to be an animated kind of digital comic book, I make sure to add a lot of detail in certain areas so that whenever the camera might zoom into one panel by itself, you can really get a good look at what's going on. But once this is maybe, possibly, hopefully, printed where you can buy it physically, you'll still see a lot of detail, but you won't see everything as much as you will digitally. And again, I'm not really a part of that process of how this comic is being made too much, so I can't say whether or not, as of right now, the time of recording this, if it will be available for purchase physically. But if it is, and I hope it will be, because I will be getting myself one for sure, you'll be able to see a little bit less detail that way. But there's something about also having a physical book, at least for me, whenever I'm reading. There's something really special about that process of having it be in your hands. For one of my classes that I'm taking at the college that I go to, we have a book club, and instead of books, like traditional books, it's comic books, which is pretty awesome. And in that class, we were reading a Hawkeye comic, and it was provided for us online, but I loved it so much that I went to my comic store nearby and I made a special order because I really want it in my hands because I love the story so much and I want to read more of it. I sadly cannot quite remember who the artist is in that particular comic. If it comes to mind, I'll definitely tell y'all, but it's really good. If any of y'all are kind of taken aback by reading anything that relates to Hawkeye because the movies have done him so dirty, not due to Jeremy Renner, but just the writers in general and stuff, I highly recommend picking up a Hawkeye comic because he's pretty awesome. He's actually a really cool character. Yeah, adding in those highlights. I love adding highlights, man. It just to put it simply, it just brings everything together really well. So I'm quite happy with that. Now, what we're gonna do is we're gonna get into coloring in some of the shards of glass in this particular scene. So I have these white inks on top of the black inks, and what I'm going to do is put the coloring for the glass in between the black inks and the white inks. So basically what that means is whenever I'm coloring, let's say I'm coloring with black, right? I'm coloring over this, You can clearly see it, right? Actually, you know what? I'm gonna use a different color just to better explain. So let's say I'm using this red, right? It's going on top of all of this, but it's behind these glass bits. So that's the layer that I'm working on right now. I'm gonna color pick a very light blue, and I'm gonna use this, what's the actual name of this? Polygon lasso tool. I never learned the actual names. And I'm gonna fill in these areas right here. Alright, so we're back. I was able to fill in all the glass shards. And now we're going to do the same thing of adding a clipping mask on top of the solids that I added. Color picking one of the shadows and just adding in some of those highlights here. Making it really look like really bright shards of glass here. Alright, so this is going to be all the shadows. And then I'll go in with pure white. Add in those highlights in certain areas. Certain select areas. Okay, so now that we have all of that, the next step I like to do for this glass is I'll take the inks, the white inks for the glass. I'm going to duplicate that layer, and now I'm going to add a blur. I'm going to blur that layer, so now it looks really shiny and really, really nice. Really adds a lot to the piece, I think. Something like that. And I really, really enjoy it. And now, what I'm going to be doing is working with some select highlights and adding in that amazing, beautiful purple smoke. So I'm just adding a highlight up in the corner here. Again, going over the blacks, just so you can get a real sense of where the light is coming from. And now, we are finally going to get to the smoke. So for this smoke, there's two main things I do. So I'll paint with my traditional paintbrush, but I also have another brush that is a smoke brush. The smoke brush looks something like this, and whenever you color, as you can see, it does a really good job of putting a lot of smoke effects on there. But this is a little bit too intense. It's also not purple. So the thing I like to do, and it's not very, very painterly, so I like to go in and actually paint in the smoke myself. This takes up a lot of time, but I'll try and take you through my thought process and show you kind of how it's all done. But yeah, we want to maintain that same color from the previous page, so I'll often color pick from the previous page just to make sure those colors are accurate to each other. I'll almost always work on a low opacity for the smoke. Get a good purple here. And I think for this first smoke bit, I'm actually going to color underneath the glass shards so they don't get covered up too much, and so you can still see it quite well. But as you can probably tell over here, my inks kind of trailed off and then stopped right here. That's because I knew that whenever this smoke came in, it was kind of going to fade almost into this purple smoke. So I knew I didn't have to really necessarily finish all the inking down there because all this is going to be covered by, well, this. But yeah, as you can see, I'm making my brush larger, thinner. I'm going kind of in a circular motion to kind of get that smoke effect, almost look like clouds. Now, I also want the smoke to feel alive almost, and you might be able to tell in a previous page with Zuko that the smoke has kind of a mind of its own. in this comic, which I really like. But yeah, since this grappling hook is going down into the smoke, it would make sense that the smoke would then push up and move out of the way. So thinking about that, and also just making it look extra cool, I'm gonna have smoke kind of go around the grappling hook to give off a really cool effect, but also add a little bit of life to everything. So I'm gonna go in, I'm gonna keep working on it, and I'll check back in with you in a second. Alright, so we're back. Hello. I added some more smoke effects, added some highlights as well. And now what I'm going to do is what I mentioned earlier, which is take the actual smoke brush and add just a little bit of texture to it all, just so we can really make everything pop. So I'll make the opacity a little bit more, sized it all down. And as you can see, whenever I add this in, it's very subtle, but it really does add a lot of texture to the piece. See a little bit better there. But yeah, I don't want to overdo it with this brush. I feel like a lot of digital artists starting out like to take advantage of a lot of like digital brushes, and that's not a bad thing, but there's something about the mix between the two which can be really, really cool. So if you're starting out in digital art, feel free to get as many brushes as you want, obviously, but I wouldn't be reliant on them, you know? I could paint all this in by hand. It would just be a little bit pointless and take up a lot of time. But there we go. Now what I'm gonna do is add a layer that's an overlay effect, which basically means that if you use a lighter color, the brights will get brighter, and the opposite for the darks. So as you can see right there, that already is looking really good. Bringing out those highlights just so that we don't completely lose the grappling hook within the fog. I still want it to be covered, but I don't want people to lose sight of the main focal point of this panel. And same goes for the dark. So I just added the dark, make the darks a little bit darker. So without that overlay, it would look like this, which again doesn't look bad, but then when you add the overlays, it really emphasizes where the focal point is. And now for the final touch, I'm going to take a white brush, no overlay, but on top of both the black and the white inks, and add in those highlights to really bring everything together and make it pop that much more. So as you can see, adding in those little highlights here and there, going on top of the blacks, can really bring a lot together, making those shards of glass have a little bit of a glow to them, really mystifying the piece. Add a little bit to the side of the wire here. I think we're gonna call it good with that particular panel. I am pretty gosh darn happy with that. The next thing I might want to experiment with is add a color balance layer, which basically allows you to change the tones of the midtones, the shadows, and the whites. So I want to make the midtones a little bit more cyan, a little bit more blue. Make the highlights a little bit more cyan and blue again, and then make sure that those shadows have a little bit of a red, more of a purple to them. So before, again, you might not even tell the difference, but I do. So before, it looks like this. After, it looks like that. It's extremely subtle. I'm hoping it catches up on the recording, but it does bring out the colors a little bit more, make everything a little bit more saturated, which again might not be what you want, but for me, I think it adds a lot to it. So now what we're gonna do is move on to coloring in Batman. So I'm gonna go ahead and add in all of those solid colors, so you don't have to painstakingly watch me just color everything in with the solids. But then I will get back to you and we can go in with actually adding the values, which is the fun part of coloring. Okay, everybody, welcome back to this page. It's been a little bit, spent a lot of time getting all those glass shards in there mainly. But I am loving the way this looks so far, and I cannot be more excited to get onto coloring. So the first thing that we're gonna do is, of course, the most boring part, which is the walls. So we're just gonna do that first and get it out of the way so that later we can get to the good stuff. I forget if I've mentioned that in a previous kind of tutorial. I think I have, or at least when I was talking about the process of inking, is that I find it best to kind of just do the really boring stuff first, so that when we do eventually get to the exciting stuff, you know, if we do the boring stuff last, it's gonna look really bad, or at least not as good as it could be, you know? Because if you put as much detail into the boring stuff as you do the exciting stuff, the piece is gonna look better as a whole. And there's a difference between boring stuff and important stuff, because something can be boring and important, but something can also be boring and not important. If it's boring and not important, I doubt you have to put a lot of detail, but if it is boring and important, then, well, you have to put detail in. But yeah, I separated the different bits into different layers and such. So all of the wood planks that are being torn apart, as well as the brick, the actual building itself besides the glass, that's all one layer. And now I'm gonna go in and add some of those highlights. I'm really loving the way the glass is turning out with this particular panel. I was worried in the inking process that it would be a bit too busy, but I think once you fill in all that stuff, I think it really starts to come together, so I'm very happy with it so far. Yeah, and some highlights over here. Because we have to remember that the light is coming from this window, from the outside. So when Batman is repelling into this area, he's not being lit from the front, but he's being lit from the back, which that's an important part that we're going to get into in just a moment. But as you can see, I'm almost done with the brick and the wooden planks and everything, because it's so little has been needed to be filled in, because the focus is on the window brick and the focus is on Batman. But yeah, and look at that. I'm already at a pretty cool place. I'm gonna add a little bit more highlights to the outside of the window. Okay. Just to emphasize that he is in fact being lit from the back. Alright, and look at that. That looks gorgeous. Promise I don't have a big ego. I'm just very proud of this so far. So I made Batman into his own kind of part here. And I did just mention to do the boring stuff first, like the glass and everything. But I think doing the glass would be beneficial last, since it is inevitably in front of Batman. So let's get on to actually coloring in Batman. Again, I am so excited for this. I've waited for so long, and now I get to do it. Literal months, you know, because these pages, they take a long time. I try to get 2 pages done a week, but that can be kind of rough. But I'm gonna add in these shadows in certain places. I'm not gonna go too crazy with the shadows, because I already put a lot of spot blacks from the inks in there. There's no real need to overdo it or anything crazy. But yeah, just adding in a lot of those black parts really emphasizing where the light is coming from. Looking pretty good so far. I think since he's so dark already, that adding in those highlights is really going to be the thing that makes it look really good. So I'm going to go ahead and just add the highlights right now, because I think I'm already done with the shadows. So the highlights on the sides of him. I'm not painting in the highlights with just a white, but rather kind of a light cyan blue. The fold and the cape. I'll get into a little bit why you can see that underneath some of these glass bits once we get to the glass. It's all about opacity. The light, a lot of light's going to be coming through his ears here onto the cowl. I'm so happy. I'm actually painting Batman. Very happy right now. Sorry if I haven't talked all that much. I'm really just adding in these highlights as they come. So the light's coming from kind of above him, but mostly just behind him. So a lot of this isn't going to have many highlights. Whereas over here, his leg, you are going to see highlights on the side here. Same thing with his boots. And this isn't the only highlight I'm going to add to the piece. There is more. But wait, there's more. Which will come later. And by later, I mean not too much later, but just, yeah. Alright. Quite happy with how this is looking. Alright, just adding in those highlights here. And that looks pretty cool. I'm very happy with this. So now what I'm going to do is add even more highlights, but these are going to be the harsher highlights, the ones that really pierce through. So I really want this to be even brighter here, along with these ends. And let's see what it looks like without the glass shards real quick, just so I can get a good idea of what's going on here. So this is what it looks like actually, without all the glass bits and stuff. But yeah, it's good to check back and forth. Alright, so we're gonna continue adding some harsh highlights to the leg here. Leg over here. Alright, that looks pretty awesome. Pretty cool. So the next bit I'm gonna do is the glass over here. Behind him, there's a layer of glass in front of him and a layer of glass behind him. The layer of glass behind him is gonna mimic this glass up here in the first panel. Okay, there we go. And then I'm going to duplicate that layer and blur it again, just like I did with the one before. And then we're going to go into the glass in front. And choose a darker blue. I'm going to make certain areas which overlap. A bit darker. Okay. Now I'm going to add some of those highlights. Alright. So I think we're making a lot of progress here. Sorry I haven't been as talkative during this part of the tutorial / behind the scenes. A lot of it is kind of just thinking about what works here, what doesn't work here. Is this shadow too bright, too dark? Because I've already really gone over the main techniques with y'all. At this point now it's just getting it done. But I know the thing that really is going to bring this together, and that is the addition of some of the smoke and extreme highlights in certain bits. Okay. So I really love this. I'm not gonna lie. But now what we're gonna do is make all those really highlighted inked parts a little blurry on the sides, which I still think really brings a lot to it. And now I'm gonna add highlights, which overlap the ink, like I mentioned in the previous panel. I want a lot of attention right here, right where his face is. So I'm gonna add extra highlights right there, which overlap in that area right here. So now your eye is more drawn to up there. And as you can see, that already does a lot. I'm gonna multiply, make the area below him a little bit darker. Just by a little bit, not by too much. You see, even those two small things change the direction of where you look quite a bit. And now we're gonna add the smoke. And again, kind of already showed you the process for that, so we'll be back to it in just a little bit. Alright, hello again. We just finished this panel. I gotta say, I am very, very happy with this. I think it turned out really well. I think the way the glass looks in these panels, especially the first one and this one, I think is something special. Seeing the introduction of Batman in this comic is pretty great, and the scene that follows is one that you're not going to want to miss. It is pretty awesome. Really, really cool stuff. And I'm excited to work on it. But yeah, basically to recap, I've taken you through the process. I've shown you how I color in my inks. I go in with solids. I find colors. If there's a previous page that has a similar color scheme, I will cherry pick and color pick from that particular scene and then make sure it flows well into one like this. I've shown you why it's important to have certain elements be highlighted, certain elements be in shadow, where the focal point is. I've also taken you through the process of how I paint in certain elements, especially the smoke and such, how all that comes together, how certain elements will be behind black inks, and some elements, select elements will be in front of some of the inks. Where's the attention being drawn to, etc., etc. So in hopes of not repeating myself over and over again on exactly how I color, I think I've taken you through the process enough to understand exactly where my mind is at and how I do all of this. So for this last panel, I'd say I'm probably just going to go ahead and get at it. So sit back, relax, and enjoy seeing a time lapse of the last panel being completed. I'm really excited to get to working on it. Thank you so much for watching these videos and for seeing my process. It's really fun to be able to show people exactly how I work and how all of this goes down. So I hope you got something out of it, whether it be a learning experience or just something fun and cool to see. Working on this comic book is truly a joy. I love illustrating Batman, and whenever I got brought on to this particular project, it's one that feels more like a passion project in a lot of ways because it's just so much fun. So thank you again for coming in and watching me work. And yeah, let's finish off this page.